Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, good evening everybody. I'm being told that the streaming is already online in case you are at the toilet and you want to watch us. No, just kidding. So thank you very much for coming along. It's a great pleasure to be with you all here. Thanks to Fundación, thanks to Salamandra Publishing House for having us and having me especially to be part of to participate on this event.
Okay. I'm just doing a little bit of introduction.
All right, okay.
You know everything. Bueno.
Okay, so we are with Abdulrazak Gurnah.
Gran escritor, por desgracia muy desconocido.
He's a great writer, but he's not very well known in Spain until he was awarded with the Nobel Prize in 2021. It was quite a tough year because of the because of the situation, travels, etc. So he was not he was not able to show up. He was not able to go on tour through different countries. But it is time to have him here with his novels, some of his novels that are the most relevant ones that have been already translated and in the market. The last one that we've received is the Desertor, that is from 2005, and is a great novel, as all his novels. I'm going to switch to English so that he doesn't have to wear the headset. I hope that you can forgive me because of my accent.
Mis conocimientos y sobre todo mi acento. I was apologizing for my English to the Spanish people that respects the language, and in your case especially, sorry because my accent is awful. But I wanted to ask you about the language and the entrance of the English in your life, the English language in your life. How did it happen? And because I read that Swahili was your maternal language, your original language.
Well, it still is. So how did I come to English is the question, yes? Okay. Well, we were colonized by the British, of course. And we learned English at school, although interestingly we didn't learn English from the word go, from the beginning. So most of the studying in the primary school, which is the first 8 years of schooling at that time, and I guess still is, was in Kiswahili. More or less everything, including it wasn't just the language part of it, but also geography, biology, whatever. It was all taught in Kiswahili. But we were still a colony, of course, at that time. But the next stage in the education, which was called secondary school, I guess high school or something like that. At that time, about 80%, if not more, of the teachers were Europeans, either British or sometimes from other parts of the English-speaking world, but only maybe 2 or 3 were Zanzibari people, which meant that all the teaching in secondary school was in English because they couldn't speak Swahili. So when you finish primary school, before you could go to the next stage, it was a very, very strict selection process, examination that you passed. And then you went into this next stage where suddenly you had to be able to understand being taught in English. It was quite traumatic, if you can imagine, because most of us wouldn't have had enough English to be able to do whatever it might be. So geography, biology, or whatever, in a language that you hardly knew, really. And then the final irony, if you like, is that at the end of the secondary school, you did an examination, which was called O-levels, ordinary level, which the paper was set and examined from the University of Cambridge. Can you imagine the kind of education we had? So you're being taught in a language you don't understand at first, and you kind of struggle along. And I'm quite sure many people performed poorly in certain subjects simply because they could not learn enough language to be able to perform, in subjects that required a kind of discursive language, as opposed to perhaps, physics or something like that, which is largely, although there is language, but it is largely a matter of knowing processes and formula and that kind of thing. So it just happened by chance that from a very young age, I'm describing this process from the age, I think, of about 10 or so, I just had really rather unusual facility in English. It's just one of those things. I mean, it's not because we were taught it, because most of my fellow students didn't. I guess it's like somebody having some kind of understanding or talent for music or something like that. And and so it just kind of went on like that. And I was always was a subject I always found easy and enjoyable, and throughout school, only to discover when I actually went to England at the age of 18 that I couldn't understand a word anybody was saying to me.
Really?
Yeah. And then I had to learn a different kind of language and learn how language works, shall we say, more dynamically rather than the language that you might read in a book or might hear on the radio or something like that. Anyway, that's not to explain why it is that I write in English, if that is what is behind your question, because the language for writing is not, I think, is not always a choice. Of course, if you only speak one language, then and you're not able to write in that language, then you're not going to become a writer. But if it so happens that you discover by chance, as I did, that in fact there is this kind of ease with English, which grew in England, both because I came to connect to the language in a more dynamic way, but also because in England I had the opportunity to read a great deal. In Zanzibar it wasn't easy to read because there were not many books around, or they were not cheap, so you read what was available at school or that you borrowed from friends, this kind of thing. But one of the great advantages of going to England for me, despite many other disadvantages, was just simply the books everywhere.
I don't know if you share with the character of the Desertor. In a moment you explain that I read it in Spanish, like, leíamos lo que nos caía en las manos sin prejuicios. Niñas, Ana Karenina, Hemingway, enciclopedias como Animales con estómago de hierro, como La avestruz de Melville, etcétera, etcétera. You were explaining for the character that you were reading everything, that it was in touch with you, the comic books and classics of the literature. That was your case too?
That was my case too, although I didn't have that range that I mentioned there. That was more like what I was doing in England. But certainly when we were growing up in Zanzibar, you just read everything. James Bond, Anna Karenina, anything that you could get your hands on without discrimination. I use that quotation from Melville, like an ostrich of potent digestion, which eats both fine herbs as well as flints and so on. So we were like that. You're reading sometimes difficult books that you didn't really even sometimes. I read Anna Karenina when I was 13, and I wept all the way through it. But I didn't really know what I was reading, really. But this is the power of literature. I was getting enough to make me weep, even though I knew nothing about 19th century Russia, or really understood anything about the kind of passions that would drive people to suicide or anything like that.
I'm always defending that the young people has to read books that are not dedicated to young readers. And I think it's a disgrace of our society that it has everything in a department, in a different department. Do you agree with that? Do you think it was great for you to have access to books that you were not ready to read, and that made a different impression when you read it?
I guess I do agree to a certain extent. That is to say that maybe you lose your fear of difficult books. You just get in there, and whereas if you're kind of being groomed, as it were, to say this is the right level for you to read, then it may be that you might be forbidden from reading certain things. I remember when I published my first book, Memory of Departure, and my elder daughter, who was then 87, she was about 15. So she read the book, because she was a great reader, which is kind of lost actually now, but anyway, never mind. But she was a great reader then, so she read the book, and she said to her younger sister, "Don't read this."
Really?
You are too young. Which subsequently she did read, but at that point she was told, no, don't read it. So I think maybe it leads to that, this kind of saying you're old enough to read this or that or that or that.
In what moment literature came to you, not just as an entertainment or just something to spend some time or to enjoy, and becomes a little different thing that started the path to become a writer? Do you remember that moment? It's a precise moment, or?
No, I don't think it was a moment. I do think I was doing a lot of reading anyway, as I said, sort of throughout this. One of the interesting things that happened with independence and with the revolution that followed independence is the departure of all the British administration officials very, very suddenly. Basically, they were asked to leave, go, including those teachers I was talking about before. So that our schools were actually shut for 3 months because there were no teachers. All the teachers have been told to go. But one of the side effects, no, that's not right, but anyway, one of the things that happened as a result of that is that there were lots of books that they couldn't or didn't want to take with them. So suddenly these second-hand bookshops appeared, which were full of the books abandoned by these British administration officials. So you could go into one of these and buy a whole box full of, usually without knowing what you're buying, for like a very small amount of money. So so we went and did that. We just went and bought these books and took them home and just read. That's how I first read a great deal of American poetry, for example, because one of these was a collection of something like 30 volumes, small volumes, but of American poems from year dot to year whatever. Great. So there was that kind of reading as well, which was just haphazard and disorderly. So I think I kind of enjoyed and really loved reading. But I think it was in England, sure, that I began to think about it, or rather started to write. And as I mentioned earlier, I was doing a lot of reading and finding out for the first time, I think, about books and about writers that I had never heard of, who were talking about things that began to make complete sense. So didn't always have to read British books, kind of thing. So you could read American books, other kinds of books, and so. And I think it was that interest that made me begin to see, yes, I can see overlaps. I can see ways of looking and asking and writing about things that I would like to try and do. So, but the bigger issue too for me was that this was a time decolonization, just post-decolonization, and the emergence of, as it turned out to be, really very important writers from Africa and the Caribbean and India. Not that there weren't some before, but now that period in the 1960s into the 1970s, we saw the emergence and the consolidation of what we now, I suppose, think of as African literature and Caribbean literature and so on. people like Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Shoika, Naipaul, etc. But I didn't see myself in them. Mm-hmm. So it seemed a good idea to say, actually it was more than that. I really felt quite strongly that when people talk about literature or writing from Africa, they talk about things that represent in some way, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, the part of the world and the people from whom or among whom I came, but we're not there. So that seemed a good reason to write.
The experience of exile also is something that makes you a writer, because sometimes you say that exile is a too big word for your experience. You don't recognize yourself under that word, even if it was probably one of the causes, no? The revolution.
Yeah. See, it depends how you describe that condition I was in. So when I protest, it's because I don't think exile describes the condition I was in. Not that I wasn't a stranger, not that I wasn't distressed by where I was and what was happening to me. I just don't think exile is the right word, because to my mind, exile describes somebody who is away from his place of origin out of principle, for a political reason perhaps, but in any case out of a principle, either because they've decided to leave out of principle, or because they have been asked or forced to leave because they're in opposition. I was none of those things. I left because I wanted to study and just fulfill myself, generally live a life. So exile doesn't seem the right word.
You use a lot the word departure in your first book. You say memory of a departure. That departure, it was at the beginning for you something radical and something for, I wouldn't say the rest of your life, but do you have this sensation that it was for a long period of time, that it was not?
Oh, it was certainly the most radical thing I did, yeah, aside from writing books. But it transformed. I mean, I don't know, of course you can't know. I don't know what or how things would have turned out if I hadn't departed. And it's one of the things that interests me. So like even in Desertion, one of the things I was interested in is asking the question, which is the right thing to do in circumstances like those? And they're not unique or peculiar, because many millions of people share those in a condition, in any case, which is either intolerable or difficult or whatever. What is the right thing to do? Is the right thing to stay, or is the right thing to leave and look for a better life somewhere else? I don't know the answer.
And how do you look the news about immigration in our times? For instance, this same week we have this arrival of 14,000 people in 4 days to the island of Lampedusa in Italy. When do you watch that images, and when do you analyze that situation in our contemporary world, do you relate it with the time you started a new life, not only as yourself, but in a different time of Europe, when we were receiving people from countries of the eastern of Europe, people from Africa? What do you think now it is the situation, and what is your analysis about it?
You pick on a particular event. This is driven to a certain extent, of course, by the floods in Libya. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, you are referring to what is going on now, people risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean in those rubber boats, many of them dying in the process. There is something, it seems to me, deeply wrong about the response of the European countries to which these people are heading. There are some who are worse than others, of course, but there is something seriously inhumane, and I don't understand it. And of course, it's not only the Mediterranean, there's also people crossing the English Channel and also risking their lives. Not quite as many in recent times as the Mediterranean. And I don't understand, for example, the way the Greek government treats these people who are fleeing from the fighting in Syria and Afghanistan and places like that. It just seems a panic and a kind of a loss of memory, as it were. I mean, if you think of it quite simply and straightforwardly, throughout the 20th century, Europe was at war with each other. This country at war with that one. Thousands and millions of people being displaced and forced out of their homes, their cities bombed. It's only 1.5 generations ago, when there are, kind of millions of refugees being forced here and there, and even the sons and daughters of refugees are themselves the ones who are saying these, who are telling these criminalizing stories of what these people are doing. I just find it very difficult to understand.
When you see in the news like this boat that the government of Rishi Sunak was preparing to put inside 500 immigrants there to wait for the resolution of their appeals or whatever, don't you think that there is a kind of use of the emergency as a political advantage in the domestic market?
Well, in the case of the UK, it's bizarre that you have a prime minister and a home secretary who speak this language, when in fact their fathers and mothers were themselves, just a matter of a year or two, would have been in the same position of this, because the law changed. So they were able to get into Britain before the law changed. That they would have been in the same position of being denied entry or whatever. And these people who are speaking this language of this intolerable language, and this ship idea. Remember, the ship was actually tried out in the Netherlands, and they decided that it was not, humane to put people in these cells, which were really like a prison, which were a prison. No, they go and buy it anyway, or whatever it is, lease it or whatever, and then there is an infection. No, it doesn't work. Stop. I don't know how many millions of pounds have already been wasted in these absurd attempts. Rwanda, now this boat, now I don't know what else they'll come up with. These absurd ideas of trying to control the movement of people. You know the story of Canute? Have you heard of Canute?
No.
I'm sure somebody here knows about Canute. Canute is one of the old kings of England pre the conquest of when the French came over in 1066. And one of the stories that's told about one of these kings, Canute was probably a Viking. You know, the Vikings are going everywhere, taking over everything. And somebody persuaded him that he was so powerful that he could control the tide. So there is this image of him standing on the beach, as he were, trying to get the sea to go back. So it's like that. So it becomes a story of King Canute, becomes a symbol, as it were, of absurd hubris in an attempt to control natural events, I suppose.
In the Desertor, you speak about a character that arrives in London. In your case, London was not the place you stayed in the first time.
No, that's why it's not about me.
Exactly. But you said about it that the first thing he has to learn as experience is the despise of the people towards him. Could you explain that feeling, that situation, what you were trying to explain to the reader about the experience that this character is going to have to support?
Well, I guess that was for me, it was one of the more shocking discoveries when I got to England, because I really didn't know very much at all about England. I remind you, this is 1967. There was no internet.
Yeah.
Zanzibar did not even have television when I left. Cinema at that time was censored. I didn't know anything. What I knew about England was what I had been taught or what I could read in a magazine or something like that. So I did not expect many of the things I found, and one of the things I found was hostility. And I had not imagined that anybody would even take any notice of me, and I could just slip in and do whatever it was I'd come to do. But no, they didn't like me. And so the discovery of that, the sort of casual hostility. When I say hostility, it doesn't mean that people come up and sort of screw up your shirt and punch you in the face or something like that. It doesn't have to be that, although occasionally you did have that sort of experience. It's more like kind of an everyday way. You get on a bus and the conductor speaks to you in a certain way, or throws the change at you, or you go into a shop and people ignore you, or people speak to you in an aggressive way, or ask you stupid questions which are clearly meant to be offensive, or fellow students at the place where you're studying are constantly making jokes about cannibals or that sort of thing. So, of course, what you then come to understand is that these people not only dislike you, but they, in some important way, think that you are kind of worthless. So that's what I'm talking about. But you remember the advice that his teacher gives him?
Yes.
He says, just be rude to them back. And that they'll like you. Because they'll think you're normal, just like them. It's not true, but it was a way of making a joke of it. Because if you were rude back to them, you might indeed get that, your shirt screwed up and your face punched. But
in your novels, there is always a subtle change of perspective. Not in all of them, but in most of them, over the characters, the protagonists of your book. Sometimes there is the time that passes and their situation changes, and in some other moments there is some more information that came about them and changed the perception of the people that is judging one of the characters. It's like you use the literature to show the other side of everyone and the other side of the people. In one book you have this merchant that is very rich, and he kind of extortion a family, and then when he comes to England, he has a conversation with one of the person that thought he was a despicable person, and suddenly he discovered it was the opposite way. You know, this kind of things happens a lot in your books. Do you think literature is that kind of observation, just to transcend the archetype and transcend the first impression of the people or the archetypical idea over people, and to transcend that and to look for other side and to bring another observation from conflicts and persons?
Well, I suppose I'm thinking that we don't always understand what we see fully. So it's not that whatever the person is, that this other side was absent and then becomes present, but that maybe it was either disguised or hidden, or the person who observes him or her has not been perceptive in seeing this other side. But also I think people have more sides than one. You know, so even hard, what at first might seem hard people perhaps also have a tender side to them in some circumstances. It's circumstances that bring things out, I think, you know, so the hardness may come out as a result of circumstances, having to deal with certain things, being a father, say, strong and that kind of thing. And maybe there are other moments we don't know, that we're not present at, where this same authoritarian figure is tender. So I don't rule it out. I'm saying, you know, that there is more than one side to people. and sometimes they do come out. Of course, there are some people who indeed are just ugly, and there's nothing we can do about them. So I like to think, though, that for most of us, despite appearances, there may be some hidden place which maybe we're forced to cover up, or we have not even understood exists.
Here in Spain, a lot of people doesn't understand the reactions or the vision of the colonial way of life, because Spain for a long time it was a country that controlled Latin American especially countries, and now there is a reaction against that, or there is a commentary against that, and it's always difficult for Spanish people to understand what they mean. You know, they're talking about my grandfather. I don't know what my grandfather did in 500 years ago. You know, it's an attitude very natural in Spaniards, and I think it's interesting for us to hear the experience of colonialism in your voice, because in your books you don't play the victim, you don't play the nostalgia of that time. You play also in both ways, in different sides. But I would like to hear your experience about what do you think colonialism from the people that are receiving that, in your case in the school, in the first years of your education. What was that sensation, that experience? Well,
first let's talk about this, what you began with, that in Spain people say, what's it got to do with me? That was 500 years ago. To some extent I think this is because many countries that have been involved in histories of that kind. I mean, the Spanish experience of colonization is brutal, to say the least, and continues to be so, because of denial, because of refusing to remember, of refusing at some stage to say it's nothing to do with us. It isn't grandfathers or great-grandfathers. They too would have said the same thing. It's not me, it's my grandfather. It's nothing to do with me. So it's a desire, it's a willingness to refuse to say, no, I don't want to know. But I gather the president of Mexico has asked Spain to apologize for what...
Yes.
So they haven't forgotten. And indeed, we can see it in the way that these ideas and these arguments are continuing. Bolivia has just had elections which involved this kind of contention, and no doubt other places as well. There is also the issue of slavery and how that plays out when you look at South America and North America and Central America. So we don't have to go very far to see how this works out. It's the same in the UK. It's the same in France. This refusal to say, this is what's happened. No, we don't know. It's nothing to do with me. Slavery? What have I got to do with it? The fact that we, meaning the British, or presumably the Spanish as well, the French as well, the fact that we have enriched ourselves as a result of these activities, well, it's nothing to do with me. But it's becoming clear that it is something to do with me. One of the big universities in the UK is the UCL, University College London, have been creating a database of who were the people who held or owned plantations in the West Indies, slave-run plantations, that is, and then tracing their families up to the present day, to see not only who they are and what they have become, but also how they've benefited as a result of this. And it turns out, in fact, one of them was the former Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, and the other one was somebody like another Prime Minister of Britain, Gladstone. And Gladstone's family, just a month or so ago, have said, yep, that's us. We benefited from this, we're sorry, and they went to Guyana, which was where these plantations were, and they have spoken and are negotiating with the government to see what can be done as, I suppose, a form of reparation, either to give money or how much money, whether to donate this money to the university, which they've already donated some, to set up a research center and so on. So this is a way of not only saying we are responsible, and there's important symbolism in doing that, even if you don't give any money, to say, yes, we were responsible. It's not my great-grandfather. We are responsible because we've benefited. So there's great symbolism in that. But there is also something of a recognition that we have benefited. And so what can we do to benefit you?
I think it will be a great idea for Spain to have a study like that. And probably the same conclusions we'll make here. And in your case, the experience of this first 15, 20 years of your life in Zanzibar, how do you relate with that in your books? Because sometimes you go farther than that. You go to the First World War in Zanzibar. How important was your experience to write about the past, or is something that you study or you talk with old people when you were young? How was your documentation on that?
Well, it wouldn't...
Personal documentation.
Sure, yeah, okay. Well, personal is also to do with all these things that you learn, you know. So, I mean, I would probably not have thought very seriously about these things at the age of 13 or something like that. I was just delighted that independence was coming, that kind of thing, because it was clear that we didn't want to be ruled by people who didn't like us. But I didn't think about these things. These are things that I learned about as I grew older and read and lived in England and heard the way they were telling the story of colonialism to themselves, and thinking, no, it's not like that. Or it wasn't like that. So you say, why do I go back, like with Paradise? Why do I go back to the early 20th century? It's because the story that colonizing countries tell themselves about what it was they were doing or why they were doing it is kind of self-flattering. We went there to help, or we went there to bring order, or we went there to, end slavery, or we went there to do whatever. And it seemed to me that was not a complete story. Mm-hmm. So you have to tell the other side. But these sorts of concerns came to me later with maturity and with knowledge about what was happening, as well as, in addition to that, what I myself felt and could imagine to be perhaps the truer, or rather the more complete story.
Mm-hmm. In your books, you don't usually do an index of terms in Swahili or terms related to all the old languages or the languages of the one of the characters of the names they use, but it's very present in the books, those expressions, those words. You have a very organic way to introduce a different language in your English. How that was something that you were very conscious to do it, or it was something that it happens very naturally? It was the way you wanted to write, because it's not usual, and I think it's one of your great virtues. You make the book not as an anthropologist look, but a very, very narrative and very character-driven books.
Good. Yeah, no, it was deliberate to do so for a variety of reasons. It wasn't just to say for embellishment, as well, as a kind of decorative, to say this is whatever. But the first reason, or one of the main reasons, is that there isn't always an appropriate word equivalent in English to what I'm trying to convey. Now, it doesn't mean that if you read it, that you will get that alternative sense that I'm after. But somebody will. And if you're a hardworking enough person, you might go and actually find out, what does this word mean? Let me give you an example. It's an example I've used before. So if anybody has heard me speak before, you might have heard me say this. But I'll give you an example. I'm thinking if Denise were...
Probably it happens in another answer still.
So take the word marehemu, which is used in various novels to speak of a person who has passed away. Marehemu so and so. Marehemu my father, for example. And I don't know how it would be translated, but somebody translated it. I had this conversation with an Italian translator. So what do you mean? Do you mean just, why can't we just say, he has passed away? My father has passed away. Or why can't we just say, my late father? And I had to explain that marehemu means, may God have mercy on his soul. And whenever you speak about a loved one who has passed away, you preface either his name, or if it were my father, by saying, marehemu. It's very, very different from saying that to saying, my late father. It doesn't have the same, to somebody from my culture, it does not have the same respect. But if you were to say in English, so I said to no, it wouldn't work, you see, because it would have to be a prefix. I say, may God have mercy to my father's soul who's passed away. It's not possible to produce that address, that way of speaking, without sounding either pompous or clumsy or something like that. So what it means is that you have to learn what does marehemu mean, and when you do, then it becomes, and maybe by inference, you can see that you know that the father has passed away. So this must be an honorific, as it were, a way of speaking feelingly about somebody. So those are among the reasons why sometimes a word which to me does not seem to have an equivalent in English is useful, so I put it in. Or sometimes it might be simply a way of giving a sort of authenticity, if you like, to, particularly if it's a command or an angry remark or something like that. Then very often I provide the sense of it, but that gives also a sense of its reality and so on. And it's also a little bit of a tease.
Do you have, when you were a kid or a very young person, do you have natural storytellers around you that you remember?
Well, people often told stories. Even our teachers told stories. We loved it when the teacher would suddenly slip out of something and start telling a story. Think, okay, you can put your pen down and listen now, and it's great fun. And I've done this myself as a teacher. When I see I'm losing a class, they're not paying attention, I'll say, this morning such and such, and everybody perks up, because you're now telling a story instead of going on about some boring something or the other.
We're going to open for you to 10 minutes of questions. So if you want to prepare, si queréis ir preparando algunas preguntas.
So if you want to prepare some questions to ask him,
we pass out the questions from the audience. I wanted to ask you, how do you think, how important is going to be? We are in Spain. We are very close to Africa. We are in some moments of our history. We were an African country too, in some ways, for the French people and things like that. There was always a joke that Africa starts in the Pyrenees, in the mountains. But what do you think, how important is going to be the African literature in the change of the continent, in the transition of the continent?
You mean European continent?
No, the African literature in the relationship with Europe and with the rest of the world. How important is going to be in the future?
Well, it's going to be, it already is and has been, of course, over the centuries important. It's just been an unequal relationship, But that's going to change inevitably because African societies are becoming more assured, more progressive. I know there are all these things people tell me, what about all these coups? But that's only looking at one phenomenon, as it were, that's going on. There are many other parts of Africa. Africa is not like one place. And there are many gifted and talented people. And in any case, this is, we have to learn, I think, and we will learn, that we live in the same world. So there has to be a kind of a better way of being with each other, rather than the way it has been historically, the relation of Europe and Africa. And then we also have the other ways in which the world, or the balance of the world, is changing. Despised places, China, for example, becoming stronger and asserting themselves in the world, and also forcing changes elsewhere, including Africa, and therefore forcing changes in the relationship of Africa to Europe or to the United States or to South America or whatever. And indeed look at South America and the way things are changing there. So I think we are seeing a transformation taking place, which is displacing the existing hegemony, as it were, of the West or of Europe and North America. That's from a political analyst who knows nothing about politics. Okay.
I suppose the reception of your Nobel Prize in Tanzania and in Zanzibar in particular, it was very, very important, and you became like the second most important person who came from Zanzibar after Freddie Mercury. But
the only people in Zanzibar who know anything about Freddie Mercury are people who are involved in the tourism business.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nobody cares who Freddie Mercury is.
I can imagine. How was that? Because we are always curious about it. How was that moment? You know, how it's to live that moment that you are at home and somebody called you by phone or someone. What happened in your case? How was that Nobel minute of your life? It
amazes me how this question comes up again and again. How was it? Well, as I've said, it was just I thought it was one of these cold calls, one of these calls that you don't want.
It was a joke? Because I think the natural reaction it will be, no, somebody's making a joke about.
Well, yeah, but also irritating. Look, I'm busy. Why are you wasting my time? Yeah, but it was only a few minutes, and then he said, he's a very nice man. I've got to meet him and know him. He's a very courteous man who simply, why don't you go to your computer and go onto the Swedish Academy website? I'm just about to make the announcement. So that's what I did. I went and looked, and he was just, how he does. He comes out from behind a curtain and started to speak in Swedish, which I don't understand. But then about the third sentence mentioned my name. So I thought, it's true.
And how do you protect yourself as a writer from an award like that?
Protect?
How do you protect in the terms of changing the way you write or changing the perception or the expectations of other people? Because there's a kind of malediction, the writers that receive the Nobel Prize, what I'm going to do, it has to be difficult to start a new page.
The difficulty was not to do with how to write or how I write or anything like that. The difficulty, if it was difficulty, I just learned to live with it, was that there is a considerable demand on my time, or was for a while, which was both part of the pleasure of it, so I'm not saying that was a bad thing, but it was quite wearing. So the publishers, it was news at first, of course, but then there also publishers from different parts, different languages and so on, who weren't dealing with me directly, they were dealing with my agents, but then also I had to. And then the new editions coming out, going to places to to be either to join in the launch of the book, well, like I'm here. But at some point, once some of the greatest part of these enthusiasms had kind of calmed down a little bit, and that was because I was able to now, with greater conviction, to say, no, thank you. Maybe next year. In fact, though, one of the things I learned was that next year does come round when you say maybe next year. But that was last year. This year I've not been saying maybe next year, or not quite as often anyway. So I was able to create some time in the middle of most of the summer. I had to myself. I said, I'm not doing anything. I'm writing, and I was just writing. It didn't seem to me that I didn't think of myself. Here I am. I'm a writer who has a Nobel Prize, and I'm writing. I was just doing the same old thing I've always done.
And in the case of Spain, did you already came to Spain before?
Not. This is since the award. This is the first time I'm coming.
Since the award, but before you knew something of Spain?
Not often. I had been to Madrid once before, and I had been to Barcelona, I think, a couple of times before, and a couple of holidays in Andalusia. That's about it.
Okay. I hope you come.
I will come
more
every month.
Every month. ¿Quién quiere ser el primero que haga una pregunta?
So come on, who wants to break the ice? So do you have any questions? Come on, don't be shy. Yeah, here.
Good evening, Dr. Gurnah. Thank you for sharing your insights with us tonight. I have a question about your writing process, and I'm curious about the extent to which you make certain accommodations for members of the public who may not be very familiar with the history of the regions and the places that you write about. And I ask this question because I'm currently reading Afterlives, and I'm quite familiar with my African history, but I'm not very familiar with the German occupation in East Africa. And I was really struck at how at the confidence with which you wrote. Like, there's this certain assumption that my readers are going to understand this. They may not necessarily understand the context right away, but they will eventually. So I guess my question is, how much hand-holding do you think is important when you're writing about a part of the world that not a lot of people know about? Asante.
Asante. Unasema Kiswahili? Unasema Kiswahili?
Kidogo Swahili.
Kidogo. Okay. Sawa. I assume that the reader will follow me. I also assume that my reader will be intelligent and curious. So I try not to condescend by saying, you don't know this, but this is what you need to know. I assume if you don't know this, if this is news to you, I will have done enough for you to be able to follow where I'm going. Enough so that if you are engaged by this, you will, especially these days, you will Google it and you'll find out. This is what I do. When I read and I find out that I didn't know that. I didn't know about the persecution of Circassian people in Russia in 1640. I just saw a photograph the other day of a demonstration of Circassian people in Istanbul holding up the board saying 1640. And I thought, what's that? And I Googled it. And there was this great, well, now we use the word genocide loosely, but in any case, there was this great massacre of Circassian people. Well, that's how I assume people would also read what I write. So there is not completely ridiculously obscure, but there is enough to be able to take you along. And if you don't know anything about it, then you find out. If you do already know something about it, you might say, I didn't know that about that particular detail, I suppose, or that particular moment. You already know your African history, but you didn't know about the Germans in East Africa. Well, time to find out, eh?
Hello.
Hi.
Well, thank you for your books, Mr. Gurnah. You already have an audience of readers here, so you get us. But it is not very easy for us. I think it's not that popular to find writers from Tanzania or from other regions in Africa. Could you recommend any contemporary author for us?
Is this still on? Oh, okay. Yeah, I could, but but you know, it's not like I'm giving a blessing to whatever. These are writers whom I enjoy. Not necessarily Tanzania. I don't do writing by nationality, so I'm not too bothered where writers come from. But I am interested in what seems to me to be a relatively new phenomenon of a number of women writers, youngish. When you say young writers these days, I mean 40 years old, right? So they're the ones who are young. I'm thinking of writers like there's a Kenyan writer called Yvonne Adhiambo Owo. There's a Somali writer, Nadifa Mohammed. There's an Ethiopian woman writer called Maza Mengiste. Start with those three. Okay? Okay.
Olvidé deciros al principio que
I forgot to tell you that we have many readers here. If you want Abdulrazak to sign your book, don't come here. He will sit down on a table with some books and he will sign them for a while. So if you want to spend some time here, great. So any further questions here at the back?
About this before, but I want to ask you, what do you think about what's happening now in Lampedusa? Lots of people are coming, and this is a problem now here in Europe, and we're like moving away, and we're doing nothing about that. What do you think we can?
Ya hablamos de eso antes.
You talk. Okay. Sorry.
No te preocupes.
You should have been here earlier.
No pasa nada, no te preocupes. Fue muy buena la respuesta, así que
There was a very good answer, so you can have a look on streaming.
maybe
Okay.
he can
Okay.
look for it. ¿Alguno más?
So anybody else?
A companion reader, Salman Rushdie companion reader, like a selection of his writings. You were the editor, or the. Do you have a relationship with him? Do you have a friendship with him, or just a professional relation?
I have met him a couple of times, but I wouldn't say we were friends. No, but I admire his work, and also it was a collection of essays by other people who also admire his work. So it's a way of putting together work, or rather essays on his work, intended to inform students, really. So it's really a kind of a scholarly book rather than a sort of about his circumstances and so on.
Bueno, pues nada.
Okay.
It was a pleasure to have you here, and I hope you
Well,
enjoyed
thank you
it.
very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.